My name is Claire. Not the Claire who once laughed without hesitation. Not the girl who used to spin in her mother's kitchen, flour on her cheeks, humming old songs she didn't even know the words to. That Claire was gone, dissolved gradually, the way watercolor bleeds at the edges until you can no longer tell where one color ends and another begins. The woman standing in front of the cracked bathroom mirror, pale, hollow-eyed, 31 years old, she was something else entirely. Something that had been burned down and rebuilt too many times to remember which version was the original. I used to look at old photographs of myself and feel a distant, aching curiosity, the way you feel about a stranger whose face has something familiar in it. A girl at 14 with her hair in two plaits, grinning at the camera in front of the family home. A young woman at 23 in graduation robes, squinting into the sun, holding a rolled diploma like a baton. And then the photographs thin out. There are fewer of them from my late 20s, fewer smiles, fewer occasions worth documenting. Or perhaps just fewer people left who thought to take the picture. But let me start at the beginning. Because if you want to understand what I became, you need to understand what they made me. And before that, you need to understand what I was. I was born into a family that wore smiles like masks. On the outside, the Harwoods were the picture of perfection. My father, Richard Harwood, was a respected businessman in the city, respected, meaning people feared him and called it admiration. He had the particular bearing of men who have built things from scratch and never quite stopped believing the world owed them reverence for it. He wore his authority lightly in public, generously even, the way men do when they are secure in its permanence. At home, it was different. At home, it was absolute. My mother, Margaret, was a woman of quiet endurance, the kind of woman who ironed creases into her pain and never let it show at dinner. She had been beautiful once, and you could still see the architecture of that beauty in her face, the elegant bones, the careful eyes. But decades of managing my father and managing the house and managing the careful distance between peace and conflict had worn her into something softer and more cautious than she might otherwise have been. She did not complain. She did not rage. She simply absorbed and redirected. The way a river absorbs rain, quietly, perpetually, and without acknowledgement. And then there was my brother, Nathan, 10 years older than me, the golden son, the one whose mistakes were always forgiven before he even made them. Nathan had my father's jaw and my mother's charm, a combination that made him easy to like and difficult to see clearly. He had grown up as the first, the heir, the one for whom everything was oriented. And this had given him a quality I could never quite name, not arrogance exactly, but assumption. An expectation of the world's cooperation that was so deeply embedded he had no idea it was there. I was the afterthought. The girl born late, the one nobody quite planned for. I understood this in the way children understand things, not through words, but through weight. The specific weight of being perpetually secondary, of watching your brother receive praise for things you had already done, of learning to take up less space, make less noise, ask for less, expect less, of learning that love in this family was rationed, and that the ration for daughters was smaller, but I didn't know the true shape of it until much later. Until the day everything unraveled, growing up, I was a serious child. I studied hard. I earned the grades nobody celebrated. I dreamed loudly inside my own head and quietly outside it. And I believed with the pure, stupid faith of someone who hasn't yet been betrayed, that family was sacred. That the people who shared your blood would always be the ones who caught you when you fell. I carried this belief through school, through university, through my MBA, through my marriage to Daniel, through all of it. Like a lamp held in both hands, protecting the flame. I was 31 years old when I found out how wrong I was. At the time, I was living back in the family home. My marriage to Daniel had ended 2 years prior, and that ending deserves its own story, its own grave. A full chapter of its own about what it does to a person to love someone who believes your purpose is to be a mirror for their greatness. But I had come back to the house I grew up in because my father had suffered a mild heart episode and my mother needed help. Or so I was told. The truth I would come to learn was far more calculated than that. I had been brought back not because I was needed. I had been brought back because I was useful. There's a difference. A devastating one. Needed implies that your presence matters, that the gap would be felt, that you are irreplaceable. Useful means that you serve a function that could have been served by other means, but that you happen to be convenient. To be brought back not as a daughter, but as a piece in a larger arrangement, that is a particular kind of dehumanization. The kind that takes a long time to name. Asterisk, the family house was a large, double-storied home in the older part of the city. Heavy wooden furniture, embroidered curtains, framed family portraits on every wall. The kind of house that looked like love from the outside and felt like a courtroom on the inside. I had spent my childhood learning its specific acoustics, which floorboards creaked, which walls were thin. Where to stand to hear the conversations happening in the study below, or the bedroom above. Nathan and his wife, Victoria, lived on the upper floor with their 2 children. Nathan had taken over my father's business 3 years ago when Dad's health had first started slipping. The transition had been smooth, efficient, and apparently inevitable. No family meeting, no discussion. No consideration of whether I might have had thoughts on the matter, or whether my MBA and 5 years of financial work might have been relevant. It had simply happened, the way things happen in families with established hierarchies, by assumption and silence. Victoria, beautiful. Sharp-tongued Victoria with her tailored blazers and her calculating eyes, had quietly, efficiently made herself indispensable to everyone in the house except me. She managed my father's social calendar. She supervised the household staff. She arranged the family dinners and the holiday gatherings. And the business entertaining with the seamless competence of a woman who has correctly identified where power lives and positioned herself adjacent to it. She was excellent at it. I could not fault the execution, only the purpose. From the moment I moved back, I felt it. A current beneath the surface. Looks exchanged too quickly across the dinner table. Conversations that stopped when I entered a room. Not with any dramatic pause, but with the slight, practiced redirection of people who have been expecting you. My mother's nervous laughter when I asked too many questions about my father's health. Nathan's particular brand of excessive friendliness, the kind that sits on top of something else, padding it, insulating it from scrutiny. I told myself I was imagining it. I told myself I was paranoid from 2 years of a failed marriage, from the specific kind of damage that comes from being made to feel small by someone you loved. I told myself that I was projecting, that I was so accustomed to the dynamics of my former marriage that I was reading them into every room I walked into. I told myself this repeatedly and almost believed it, but the body knows, doesn't it? Long before the mind catches up, the body has already understood. My stomach tightened every time Nathan spoke to me too kindly, that particular overwarmth that functions as preemptive apology. My hands shook slightly whenever Victoria offered to help me with something. Her assistance always edged with something that felt like surveillance. My chest ached every time my father looked at me with that expression I couldn't name. Not guilt, not love, something uncomfortably close to both. It was my mother who finally cracked. Not intentionally. My mother was not a woman of intention. She was a woman of pressure. Of the moment when something held too long finally gives way. It was a Tuesday in November. Cold, gray, the city loud outside the kitchen window. I was making tea and she was sitting at the table rolling dough, not looking at me. The kitchen smelled of flour and the particular ghost of every meal that had ever been cooked in it, spice and warmth, and all the accumulated labor of decades. We had been quiet for a long time, a comfortable quiet that had become, I realize now, a hiding in quiet. And then, into that quiet, she said, "Claire, whatever happens, know that I had no choice." I put down the kettle, slowly, as if fast movements might shatter something. "What are you talking about, Mom?" She didn't answer. Her hands kept moving, rolling and pressing, rolling and pressing. Her eyes were fixed on the dough as if it were the most important thing in the world. "Mom, the property," she said finally, so quietly I almost didn't hear it. "Your father is going to change the property documents. All of it. Everything in Nathan's name. The silence that followed was the loudest thing I had ever heard. When? I asked. Next week. The lair is coming. I stood there for a very long time. Long enough for the kettle to boil over, for the steam to cloud the window, for the gray afternoon to slide toward evening. I stood there and I thought, so this is what it feels like. This is the thing that changes everything, and it wasn't the property that broke me. I want to be clear about that. I am not a woman who bleeds for money or land or square footage. What broke me was the understanding behind the words. The understanding that this had been planned. That my being brought home, my being present, domestic, useful, manageable, had been part of the plan. Keep her close. Keep her occupied. Get it done before she figures it out? They had used my love against me? That is the particular cruelty I have never forgiven. Not the inheritance. Not the money. The love. The love I brought home with me. The genuine care I felt for my aging parents. The desire to be present and useful and real in the life of my family. They had looked at that love and seen a tool. They had looked at what was most human in me and made it a lever. I did not react. Not immediately. This is something people misunderstand about women like me. We are not slow. We are not passive. We are strategic in the way that people who have been underestimated their whole lives learn to be quietly, beneath the surface, while wearing the appropriate expression above it. I had spent 31 years in a family that did not fully see me. I had spent 3 years in a marriage that diminished me. I had not wasted any of that. I had, without entirely realizing it, been learning. I went to my room that evening, sat on the edge of my bed, and I thought about every conversation from the past 3 months with the careful, cold attention of a prosecutor reviewing evidence. Every dropped comment. Every deliberate deflection. Every time Nathan had asked about my plans and nodded too eagerly when I said I had none. The specific eagerness of a man who needed my absence to be permanent. I thought about the documents I had seen on my father's desk 2 weeks ago. The ones Victoria had swept into a folder too quickly when I walked past, her movements precise as a card player covering a hand. I thought about the lawyer's card I had found in the kitchen drawer and thought nothing of. At the time, I thought about my father's company, Harwood Industries, not a dynasty but a solid, mid-sized business, property, investment, commercial rentals across 3 districts of the city. Worth, at last estimate, somewhere between $8 to $12 million. The kind of wealth that doesn't make you untouchable but makes you worth protecting. Worth, to some people, the engineering of a plan, and I thought they had brought me back because absent daughters make noise. Absent daughters file legal challenges from a distance, hire lawyers without family pressure weighing on them, have clarity of perspective that proximity erodes. But a daughter who is present, attending domestic, filling her days with her father's medication and her mother's grocery, runs. She is a daughter who is accounted for, visible, manageable. And while she tends to the people she loves, the documents can be quietly rearranged around her. I had been brought home to be watched. And while I was watched, I was being stolen from. I thought about what I had given up to come back. I had been in the middle of rebuilding. 2 years post-divorce, I had started a small financial consultancy with my oldest friend. Sophie Mercer, nothing grand but mine, genuinely mine. Built with my MBA and my stubbornness and my refusal to lie down after everything the marriage had taken from me. I had paused it to come here. I had told Sophie it would only be a few months. I had believed that, sitting on that bed in November, I counted up everything this family had cost me. Not just this moment, all of them. The childhood of secondary position. The marriage I had entered partly to escape and partly to prove I was worth choosing. The career I had built in the spaces between all of it. In the early mornings and the after hours and the stubborn gaps between everyone else's demands. All of it measured now against the calculation that had been made in this house without my knowledge. And I felt, not grief, not even anger. Something older and colder. And more useful clarity. The kind of clarity that comes when the fog of hope finally burns off, and you see the landscape as it actually is. When you stop asking why people treat you this way and start simply noting that they do. When you stop appealing to their love and start building your own position, I knew exactly what I needed to do. Asterisk, the first thing I did was call Sophie. Sophie Mercer was my business partner and my oldest friend, older than my marriage, older than most of my adult mistakes. The kind of friend who knows your history well enough to understand your present without needing every detail explained. We had been friends since we were 19 and shared a university dormitory room. And in the 12 years since then, she had seen me through everything: my father's coldness, my mother's silences, my marriage, my divorce, and the long, slow rebuilding that had followed. She had never once told me what I should feel. She had never once been anything other than precisely what I needed. She picked up on the second ring. "Tell me," she said. That was it. No greeting. She already knew from my silence something was wrong. I told her everything. All of it, as completely and calmly as I could manage, the way you recount a case file rather than a personal catastrophe. My voice was steady. I had learned over years of marriage to a man who used tears as proof of irrationality, to separate the experience of feeling from the presentation of it, to feel everything while showing only what was useful. When I finished, there was a pause, and then she said, "Right, how long before the lawyer comes?" 6 days. Okay, what do you have access to? This is why I love Sophie. She didn't say how awful or "I'm so sorry" or "we'll figure it out together" in the vague, well-meaning way that comforts without helping. She said, "What do you have access to?" She understood instinctively that what I needed was not comfort but architecture, the beginning of a plan, a scaffold to build from. She had always known the difference between being heard and being helped, and she always gave me both in the correct order. "I have access to the house," I said. "I have access to Dad. I have access to the documents room. He hasn't changed the code. I don't think he thinks I'd ever look." "Then we start there," said Sophie. Over the next 4 days, I became a different kind of daughter. I continued to wake up early and make my father's morning tea. I continued to drive my mother to the market on Thursday mornings, carrying the heavy bags without complaint, asking about the neighbors and the women in her reading group and all the small domestic news of her days. I continued to sit with her in the evenings while she watched her dramas on television, laughing at the right moments, refilling her tea. I continued to smile at Victoria over dinner and ask after her children's school examinations and admire her blazers. I continued to be exactly who they expected me to be, the soft, manageable, grateful Claire who had come home. But in the in-between hours, in the quiet of late nights when the house held its breath, in the empty afternoons when Nathan was at the office and Victoria was at her club and my parents rested, I became someone else. I went into the documents room. My father had always been meticulous about paperwork, a quality he had not passed to Nathan, who preferred delegation to detail. The filing cabinets were steel gray and organized by year and category, everything labeled in my father's neat, deliberate handwriting. The room smelled of old paper and leather and something faintly chemical that I associated with all my childhood with adult seriousness. With the knowledge that important things happened in this room, and I was not a part of them, I moved carefully, photographing rather than removing, leaving everything exactly as I found it. My phone was on silent, its flashlight casting a thin white beam across the cabinets. I worked systematically in the order that made logical sense, and I did not allow myself to feel the fear until after I had locked the documents room behind me and was back in the safety of my own room. What I found over 3 nights of careful, silent searching was more than I had expected. The first thing I found was the original will, a document drawn up 12 years ago, before my marriage, before Nathan had taken over the business. In that will, the property and company shares were divided equally between Nathan and me, equal. My father, whatever his faults, had once written my name beside my brother's. He had once seen us as equivalents. That will was dated and witnessed and entirely legal, and it had my name in it, and for a moment holding the photograph of it on my phone screen, I felt something that took me a moment to identify. Relief, the specific relief of proof that you were not always imagined. The second thing I found was a draft of the new will, the one being prepared. In this version, my name appeared once in the list of people to receive a single residential property, The oldest and smallest house in the portfolio? A property in a satellite town 2 hours from the city that I had never once visited and had no connection to. Everything else, the company, the commercial properties, the investments, the main family home, went to Nathan. My name, which had once stood beside my brother's, had been reduced to a footnote. A gesture. A small, insulting appeasement that was designed to look like generosity. The third thing I found made my hands go cold. It was a letter. Handwritten, in Victoria's neat, slanted script, on the headed paper she used for personal correspondence. Addressed to my father. Dated 8 months ago, 3 months before I had been called back to the family home. I sat down on the floor of the documents room to read it. I sat on the floor because my legs required it. Asterisk Victoria had written to my father with a proposal. She framed it as concern for his health, for the stability of the business, for Nathan's growing family, for the long-term welfare of everything that the Harwood name encompassed. She was careful and thorough, and she deployed the language of care and practical necessity the way lawyers deploy it, to make conclusions that serve one party appear as neutral common sense. She noted, delicately, that the company could not afford divided ownership. That joint inheritance created exposure. Created conflict, created the kind of instability that had toppled larger enterprises than theirs. She noted that my divorce made me an unstable influence and a legal risk, that any future marriage or partnership of mine could complicate the company's ownership structure, could introduce third parties into what should remain a family matter. She noted that it would be kinder and cleaner to settle matters now, while Dad was still of sound mind. Before complications arose. She had written this letter before my father's heart episode, before the episode that had brought me home. I sat on the floor of that documents room for a long time. The house was silent around me. My father slept 2 rooms away. My mother slept beside him, doing what she had always done, lying beside a man she loved imperfectly, and staying because love and imperfection were not, to her, contradictions. Upstairs, Nathan and Victoria and their children slept in the house my father had built. Above the documents that were taking it from me, I was 31 years old, sitting on a cold floor in the middle of the night. And I finally completely understood the heart episode.
The timing.
The call to come home. The careful management of my presence. The way I had been kept occupied, kept visible, kept close enough to watch. All of it engineered. Not entirely fabricated. My father had genuinely had a medical event. His health was genuinely declining. But the use of it, the deployment of it as a mechanism to bring me back, to keep me contained in the space of my own love and care while the paperwork was rearranged beneath me, that was Victoria's. Architecture. My sister-in-law had built a cage around me and called it family. I photographed the letter. I photographed the old will and the draft of the new one. I returned everything exactly as I had found it. I went back to my room. I sat on my bed in the dark for a while, not thinking, just breathing, just letting the full knowledge of what I now held settle into me like weight finding its place, and I made a decision. Not revenge. Not yet. Something that had to come first. Evidence, position, power, I. Called Sophie the next morning. She came to the house under the pretext of visiting me. She had done this before. It raised no suspicion. Sophie had been a fixture in my life for long enough that her presence in the family home was unremarkable. We sat in my room with the door closed and I showed her everything on my phone, laying it out in order. The original will, the new draft, the letter, watching her face as she read. Sophie read slowly. She read it twice, very carefully, in the way she read financial reports, analytically, looking for the load-bearing structures. When she finished, she looked up at me. "You need a lawyer before they get to theirs," she said. "I know. Specifically, you need a lawyer who understands inheritance and family property law. And you need to file a caveat on those properties before the documents are changed. If you can get that filed in the next 48 hours. "I know, Sophie." She paused. Then, more quietly, "How are you?" "I'm fine, Claire." "I'm angry," I said, which was more honest. "I'm furious. But I'm not going to let that make me messy. I'm going to be very, very clean about this. She nodded. She understood exactly what I meant. We had both seen women get messy, seen what happened when pain overrode strategy. When the need to be understood overtook the need to be effective. When the desire for acknowledgement of the wrong became more pressing than the work of righting it. I had been that woman once, in my marriage, when I had begged and pleaded and made myself small and loud and then smaller again in the hope that, if I could just explain it clearly enough, if I could just make Daniel see, the thing would change. It never changed. Not through understanding. Only through action. Love was not enough. Clarity of suffering was not enough. Documents were enough. Lawyers were enough. Evidence was enough. Sophie had a contact, a family law attorney named Adam Clark, sharp and thorough. The kind of lawyer who had spent 15 years specializing in exactly this type of family asset dispute. The quiet ones. The ones that happened between people who loved each other and did terrible things to each other in the name of that love and its various practical consequences. We called him that afternoon. He agreed to see us the next day. I went to that meeting and I laid everything on the table. The photographs. The old will. The draft. Victoria's letter. The timeline I had reconstructed from my own memory, from 3 months of stored, categorized, carefully noted observations. I was clear, organized, unemotional. Adam listened with the particular focused stillness of someone building a case in real time, asking occasional brief questions that told me he was already several steps ahead. When I finished, he said, "You have more here than you think you do." He filed the property caveat within 24 hours. This meant that any change to those property documents would now require court notification. My name was legally flagged as a potential interested party, an heir with standing. The lawyer my father had hired would hit a wall the moment he tried to finalize the transfer. It was not a blockage, but it was a delay, and in that delay was space. And in space was the possibility of everything. It was not victory. It was the door to victory, held open just barely, but it was mine. I had made it. With my own hands in the quiet hours of a house that was trying to erase me. I had made it, the day the family lawyer came to the house. I was in the kitchen. I had made sure to be visible, domestic. Unremarkable, making a pot of soup that did not need to be made. Chopping vegetables with unnecessary concentration. I heard the conversation through the walls. The study door was thick but not impenetrable. Not to someone who had grown up in this house and knew exactly where to stand in the hallway to hear what was being said inside. I heard the lawyer's voice, low and apologetic, carrying the particular tone of a professional delivering news that complicates a simple transaction. I heard my father ask what the problem was, his voice controlled, authoritative, slightly irritated in the way of a man whose instructions have not been followed. I heard Nathan's voice rise. Not loud, Nathan was never loud, but sharp, the sharpness of someone recalibrating quickly. I heard the phrase "my name" spoken in a tone that was not kind. I heard Victoria's silence, which was somehow the loudest thing in the room. The lawyer left without completing anything. The documents remained unchanged. That evening, Nathan came to find me. He stood in the doorway of my room, tall, handsome in the way that men who have never faced consequences remain handsome. Easy and unbothered in his posture, his hands in the pockets of his slacks. He looked at me with an expression I had seen on his face my whole life, the gentle, patient condescension of an older brother who expects, without ever having thought about it, to be obeyed. "Claire," he said, "we need to talk." "Of course," I said. I closed my book and folded my hands in my lap, and I looked at him with my most pleasant expression. "There seems to be a legal issue with the property transfers." "Oh?" "The lawyer says there's a caveat filed. He mentioned your name." He waited for more. I gave him nothing. I simply sat and looked at him pleasantly and said nothing, and watched him reckon with the fact that I was not going to fill the silence for him. "Did you do this?"
He said finally. "I engaged a lawyer," I said.
"Yes." A pause. Something moved across his face, not anger yet. Something more like adjustment, like a man recalibrating his approach. Searching for the version of this conversation that ends the way he needs it to. "Claire, I think there's been a misunderstanding, Nathan." My voice was still pleasant. I found Victoria's letter to Dad. The adjustment stopped. His face went still. And in that stillness I saw, for the first time, something I did not expect. A flicker of something that might have been shame. Brief, quickly buried. But there. I know the timeline, I said. I know when the letter was written. I know it was written before Dad's health episode. I know I was brought back here deliberately, for reasons that had nothing to do with caring for our parents. And I know what the new documents say. I paused. I have copies of everything. He said nothing. He was standing in my doorway and saying nothing, and for the first time in my 31 years, I was watching my older brother not know what to say. Nathan, who had always known what to say. Nathan, who had moved through life with the easy fluency of a man for whom the right words had always arrived. I am not going to disappear, I told him clearly and evenly. I am not going to be managed or minimized or written out of my own family's history. I am here. And I am going to remain here until this is resolved fairly. He left without another word. I sat in the quiet he left behind and breathed. Not the shallow breathing of relief. This was not over. It was barely beginning, but the long, steady breathing of someone who has done the thing they needed to do and is still standing. This was not triumph. Not yet, but it was the first time in my life I had said what needed to be said and not softened it, not cushioned it, not apologized for it before or after. Not added a, but I understand your position, or I know you mean well, or I'm probably overreacting. Not made it easier for the other person to swallow. Just, I know. I have the proof. I am not leaving. It was a beginning. It was the most important beginning of my adult life. What happened after that was what always happens when a secret is exposed in a family. Not immediate resolution, but escalation. The quiet management of the situation gave way to open pressure. The comfortable architecture of mutual pretense cracked along its fault lines. It started with my father. He called me to the study the following morning. The same study where the lawyer had sat the day before. Where the same heavy desk and the same orderly bookshelves had witnessed a very different conversation. He was in his chair behind the desk, which told me something about how he intended to frame this, not as father and daughter, but as patriarch and problem. He looked older than I had noticed. The health episode had aged him. Or perhaps it was something else. Perhaps it was the particular aging that comes from having looked at something you were about to do and having it suddenly, unavoidably, reflected back at you. Sit down, he said. I sat. Your brother tells me you filed a legal claim on the property. I've ensured my interests are legally protected, yes. Why? His voice was measured, but there was something underneath it. Not quite hurt, not quite anger. Shame, perhaps. The specific shame of a man who has been caught doing something he knew was wrong, and who is trying to frame the problem as your reaction rather than his action. Because I found the new will, Dad, and Victoria's letter. He said nothing. His eyes moved to the window and stayed there. I found the letter she wrote to you 8 months ago, I continued. I know the plan. I know why I was brought home. I know what was going to happen next week. And I know how long it has been in preparation. A long silence. The clock on his desk ticked. Outside, the street noise went on, indifferent. The city carrying itself forward without interest in the small, quiet catastrophes happening inside its houses. Your brother has a family, he said finally. I know.
He has children.
A wife, responsibilities. I know, Dad. The business needs clear, unified ownership. I know all of the arguments, I said quietly. I've already heard them. I read them in Victoria's letter. She makes them well. I paused. But I have a question for you. Not about the property. One question. He waited, still not looking at me. Did you think about me? When you agreed to this, when you decided to bring me here and change the documents, did you think about me at all? Not about what I would do when I found out. Not about the legal complications. About me. About your daughter? He didn't answer. He looked at the desk. He looked at his hands, which were folded on the desk in the posture of authority he had maintained his whole life. He looked anywhere but at me. And in his silence I had my answer. Not that he hadn't thought of me. I believe he had. I believe it had troubled him, in the way that a distant discomfort troubles a person before it becomes unavoidable. But he had thought of me the way people think of inconvenient things, as a problem to be managed rather than a person to be considered, as a variable in an equation rather than the daughter whose handwriting he had watched form over 30 years. I stood up. "I love you," I told him. "I love you, and I know you are not a bad man. But you are doing something wrong, and you know that you are, and I am not going to pretend otherwise to make it easier for you. The discomfort you feel right now is correct. It is the appropriate response to what you almost did." I walked out. I did not slam the door. Slamming would have been satisfying and useless, and I was done with useless. Victoria came next. She found me in the garden the following afternoon, alone, deliberately, away from witnesses. The garden in November was all bare structure, the ornamental trees stripped to their architectural bones, the beds covered and waiting. Victoria wore cream linen that she somehow made practical, her hair pulled back. Her expression calibrated to something between concern and authority, the precise blend of a woman who has practiced this particular face. "Claire, can we speak frankly? When have we ever not?" I said, which was not quite true, but established the register I wanted. She sat across from me, crossed her legs, clasped her hands in her lap, the posture of a woman conducting a meeting in a garden. "I understand you're hurt," she said. "I genuinely do. But I need you to understand that everything I've done has been for this family's benefit. For stability. For the children. For the business that your father spent 40 years building." "I know," I said. I read the letter. A flicker crossed her face, the smallest, most controlled flinch of someone realizing the full extent of the exposure, but she recovered quickly. Victoria was always fast. That was the thing about her. She was genuinely good at what she did. She was a planner, a strategist, and in another world, under different circumstances, I might have found that admirable. "Then you understand my concerns were legitimate. A divided company ownership, the legal complexity, the risk." "Victoria." I kept my voice very level. "Let me tell you what I understand. I understand that you identified me as a threat to your family's financial position. I understand that you developed a strategy to neutralize that threat. A strategy that involved using my father's health and my mother's worry and my own love for my family as tools. I understand that you executed that strategy with considerable skill and patience over a period of at least 8 months." I paused. I actually think it was quite brilliant, technically. The engineering of it. She looked at me with an expression I had not seen on her face before, wariness. Victoria was rarely wary of me. That was changing. "But here's what I also understand," I continued. "I have copies of the letter. My lawyer has copies of the letter. The caveat has been filed. And I am prepared to contest any will that does not reflect equal inheritance. In court, publicly, for as long as it takes." I held her gaze. "Do you understand what a public inheritance dispute would do to your husband's business reputation? To his client relationships? To the corporate standing of Harwood Industries?" Silence. The garden held its bare, attentive quiet. "We can do this easily," I said. "Or we can do this expensively and publicly. The choice is genuinely yours." Victoria stood up. She was controlled. I will give her that. I always gave her that. Her face gave away almost nothing. Only her hands, very slightly, betrayed her. She uncrossed them from her lap and recrossed them once. Too quickly, before she rose. "You've changed," she said. And she meant it as an accusation. "Yes," I agreed. "I have." She walked back into the house. I stayed in the garden until the cold became more than I could reasonably absorb, and then I went in too and made myself tea, and sat alone in the kitchen and thought, I am still here. I am still here. It was 3 days after my conversation with Victoria when my mother came to my room in the middle of the night. I was awake. I had been sleeping badly for weeks. The way you sleep when your mind runs its circuits continuously, checking and rechecking, building scenarios, rehearsing conversations. The house was quiet with the specific quality of a house that has been holding its breath. And then I heard her soft knock, the particular rhythm of it, too close. One after a pause, that was unmistakably her. That had been hers for as long as I could remember. "Come in." "Mom." She came in wearing her old blue dressing gown. The one she had owned so long its hem had frayed and been restitched twice. Her graying hair was loose around her shoulders and her face was, without the careful composure she maintained during the day, without the powder and the settled expression and the slight, controlled brightness she wore as protection. Without all of that, she looked smaller. She looked very tired. She looked, I thought with a sudden sharp ache, like herself. She sat on the end of my bed and for a long time she said nothing. I waited. I had learned with my mother that silence was often more useful than filling it. "I should have told you," she said at last. "When they first talked about it, I should have told you right away." "Why didn't you?" "Because your father would have been angry with me. Because Nathan would have been hurt. Because—" She stopped, swallowed, looked at her hands in her lap. "Because I hoped that it would never really happen. That your father would come to his senses before it got to this point. But he didn't. He loves Nathan very much."
He loves me too, I said.
"Or he says he does, Claire, Mom." I reached out and took her hand. Her hands were dry and worn. The hands of a woman who had worked and worried and smoothed things over for decades, whose labor was in the texture of her palms. "I'm not angry with you. I promise I'm not. But I need to know, do you think what they planned was right? Not practical. Not understandable, right?" She was quiet for a long time. In the quiet, I could hear the house breathing, the particular rhythm of an old building settling into its own weight. "No," she said finally, very quietly. "No, I don't. I never did." "Then say so." "Not to me, to Dad. Say what you think. Say what you know is fair." She looked at me with an expression I had never quite seen on her face before. It was complex and layered. The expression of a woman encountering something she had been circling for a long time and finally looking directly at. Something that might have been not pride exactly, not yet, but the beginning of it. The precursor to pride, recognition. "You've always been braver than me," she said. "You gave me that," I told her. "You gave it to me by example, even when you didn't know it. Every time you held the house together, you showed me what endurance looks like. I just learned to aim it differently." She stayed with me for a long time that night. We didn't say much more. But she held my hand, and that was its own kind of language, old and specific and entirely between us. A language that needed no translation. The next morning, she spoke to my father. I do not know exactly what was said. I was not in the room, and my mother never told me, and I did not ask. I believe that there are conversations that need to remain between two people in order to do their full work. But I heard their voices, low and continuous, for a very long time. And when my father came to find me in the garden that afternoon, something in his face had shifted. Not surrender, asterisk, not quite. But something had moved in him, some internal obstruction, some resistance that had been quietly and finally worn through. "I want to talk properly," he said. "You, me, Nathan. Sit down together without lawyers and talk like a family."
"Yes," I said.
"I'd like that." We sat at the dining table, the big one, the one we had eaten 1,000 family dinners at across my whole life. The table where my father had told Nathan about the business handover with a pride he had not tried to conceal. The table where I had once announced my MBA scholarship and been told, kindly, that there was no need for it. The table where my mother had served hundreds of meals and never once been thanked in the way that thanks is owed to a person whose labor is constant and invisible. This time the table held us. Differently, Nathan was already seated when I came in. He looked older than he had at the beginning of all this, not tired exactly, but altered like a man who has been forced to look at something that cost him, and the looking was visible in his face. My father sat at the head of the table. My mother sat beside me. Her presence there, deliberate and stated, she had insisted quietly, and my father had not argued, was its own kind of testimony. Victoria was not invited. My father had been clear about that. Whatever Nathan felt about it, he had come without her, and the fact that he had come without her told me something about the state of their private conversations that I did not ask about and did not need to. My father spoke first. He was formal about it. He had prepared what he wanted to say, I could tell, had probably rehearsed it. He spoke about the company, about his fears for its future, about the complications of shared ownership and the history he had built and his desire to see it continue and grow. He spoke about Nathan's family, the children, the responsibilities. He was not cruel. He was not dismissive. He had clearly thought about what he was going to say and tried to say it well, but he spoke for a long time without once saying the word fair. When he finished, I spoke. Dad, I don't want to fight you. I don't want to fight Nathan. I want to say something honestly, and I want you to hear it completely before you respond. He nodded. What was planned was not fair. Not the new will. Not the way I was brought back here. Not the years before this, in which the original will remain unchanged while I lived my life and built my career believing that my position in this family was what it had always been. I have not dramatized this. I have not invented it. I have the letter and the documents to show exactly what was planned and when. I paused. Around the table, everyone was still. I am not asking for more than what is mine. I am asking for what was always mine. Half, the half that was in the original will. The half that existed before someone decided I was inconvenient. The business can't be split 50-50, then buy me out. If Nathan wants full ownership of the company, let it be structured properly. Let there be an independent valuation, a payment at market value, a legal agreement that is transparent and binding. I am not asking to sit in meetings I have no place in. I'm asking not to be erased. I looked at my father. I am asking to be treated as your daughter. As the person you wrote into your will 12 years ago and then agreed to remove without telling her. Silence. Nathan looked at the table. When he finally spoke, his voice was quieter than I had heard it. I didn't know about the letter, he said. About the plan. I knew Victoria had spoken to Dad. I didn't know she had written to him like that. I didn't know the timing of it. I said nothing. I didn't know if I believed him. And I wasn't certain it mattered, not because the truth of it was irrelevant, but because whether he had known or not, he had benefited from it.
He had accepted the structure that was being built around him.
He had not asked the question he should have asked. Where is Claire in this? I should have made sure you were included in the conversation. From the start.
Yes, I said.
You should have. My father was looking at his hands. He looked in that moment not like the patriarch at the head of the table, but like an old man who was tired and perhaps, for the first time, afraid. Afraid of the thing he had almost done. Afraid of what it said about him. Afraid of the gap between the man he believed himself to be and the man who had sat in his study and agreed to a plan designed to disinherit his daughter. What do you want? He asked me. I want what's fair. I want an equal share of the inheritance, as stated in the original will. Or I want a proper buyout agreement for the company shares, with market valuation, documented and legally binding. I want my name on the family properties that belong to both of us by right. And I want it done through a proper legal process, with full transparency with Adam's involvement, so that there is no ambiguity and no room for revision. And the lawyer? My lawyer stays involved until everything is finalized and signed. After that, this conversation never needs to happen again. My father looked at Nathan. Nathan looked at me. My mother sat quietly, not speaking but present, entirely, deliberately, irreversibly present. All right, my father said at last. We'll do it properly. It was not the end. There would be more meetings, more negotiations, more careful and exhausting attention to documents and language and legal terminology. There would be tension in the house for months, the particular tension of people who have said hard truths to each other and have not yet found the equilibrium on the other side. There would be a cold war with Victoria that would last longer than any of the formal proceedings. A managed distance that was the price of what had been done and what had been uncovered. But in that moment, at that table, with my mother's hand resting beside mine, Something fundamental had changed. I had not been written out. I want to be honest with you about what came next. Because stories like this, the ones about women standing up for themselves, drawing lines, refusing to be erased, they often end at the moment of standing up, as if that's the hard part. As if the decision is the only battle. As if once you have spoken clearly and been heard, the difficulty is over. It isn't. The weeks that followed were some of the most exhausting of my life. Not dramatically terrible, not the acute pain of crisis, which has its own adrenaline to carry you through. Exhausting in the quieter, more grinding way of sustained effort. Of waking up every morning in a house full of conflict and having to decide again to hold your position. Of performing normalcy at the dinner table while lawyers exchanged correspondence. Of being both a daughter and a legal opponent simultaneously. Within the same four walls. Victoria went quiet in the way that certain people go quiet, when they are reorganizing rather than retreating. She was surface cordial. She passed the salt at dinner. She asked after my health. She made all the appropriate sounds of a woman coexisting peaceably with another woman in the same house. But beneath that surface there was a current, cold and deliberate, that touched everything. Her children, coached or simply absorbing the atmosphere the way children absorb everything, became formal with me. The household arrangements shifted subtly, almost imperceptibly, in ways that were hard to articulate but unmistakable in their effect. Nathan was caught in the middle and dealt with it by being present at almost nothing. He spent longer hours at the office. He traveled for business more frequently than he had in the previous 3 months combined. He became essentially absent, and in his absence, the house fell into Victoria's management. And her management was a kind of weaponized efficiency. Everything done correctly and nothing done warmly. My father went back and forth. This is the hardest thing to write about, the truest thing. My father was not a strong man in the ways that matter. He was successful and commanding and respected in all the practical arenas of his life. But in his family, in the complicated private space of the people he had made and was responsible for, he was a man who wanted resolution more than righteousness, who preferred things to be smooth and settled over things being right. The legal process moved forward because he had agreed to it, but there were days when I could see him wanting, desperately, for me to simply accept less and make the discomfort stop. Days when he would say, in the garden or over tea, things like perhaps a compromise or we don't need lawyers for everything. And I would look at him and say gently, we do need lawyers for this. And we would both sit with that. I did not make it easy. I want to say that clearly. I held my position. I did not soften it to ease his discomfort or assuage his guilt. I loved my father and I was holding him to the consequences of what he had nearly done. And both of those things were true simultaneously. And I learned to carry both of them. The hard months taught me things I could not have learned otherwise. I learned that love and fairness are not the same thing. That a person can love you and treat you unfairly, can love you sincerely and still consistently choose what is convenient over what is right. That the presence of love does not preclude the presence of exploitation, and that acknowledging the exploitation does not require denying the love. Both things can live in the same house. I learned that the women in families who hold things together often hold them together at the cost of their own position. My mother had spent decades absorbing conflict, smoothing edges, making peace between people who should have been making peace themselves. And that labor, constant and invisible and never named as labor, had contributed to a structure in which she had no formal voice and I had no guaranteed future. She had kept the peace, and the peace had cost us. I learned that my brother was not my enemy, even when he behaved like one. He was a man who had accepted an unfair advantage without examining its source, which was its own kind of moral failure. Not malice, but passivity in the face of injustice that benefited him. The distinction matters, not to excuse it, but to understand it accurately. An accurate understanding I was discovering. The only foundation worth building on. I learned that Victoria was neither monster nor villain, but something more mundane and more dangerous, a very capable woman who had decided to deploy her capabilities entirely in service of a zero-sum game. She had calculated her position and pursued it with thoroughness and intelligence. I did not hate her. I held a cold, clear-eyed recognition of what she was capable of. But I did not forgive her. I am still working out whether I ever will, and I learned something about myself that I had not known before this year. I learned that the version of me who had returned to this house, tired, recently divorced, uncertain, believing herself to be coming home to something, was not the final version. That whatever I had been made into by 2 years of a difficult marriage and the years before of not quite being seen, it was not fixed. It was not the definition of me. I was still becoming. At 31, after everything, I was still in process. And the process was not, as I had feared, damage assessment. It was construction. Asterisk. There is a chapter of this story that belongs to Sophie. And I cannot tell the story without telling it. Sophie had been my constant throughout this, on the phone every day. In the city with me twice a week, managing the consultancy largely on her own while I was consumed with the family situation. She did this without complaint, without scorekeeping, without the particular martyrdom of someone who wants their sacrifice acknowledged. She did it with the particular generosity of someone who doesn't measure friendship in receipts, because they don't think of it as a transaction at all. About 4 months into the legal process, when things were progressing but not yet resolved, I had a night where everything caught up with me at once. It had been a long day, a difficult session with Adam in the morning, a tense dinner at the family table in the evening, a phone call with Nathan that had ended inconclusively, and left me with the particular hollowness of a conversation that accomplished nothing. My mother had looked tired in a way that frightened me. I had gone to my room, and the walls of it, which had held me through 11 weeks of this, felt suddenly like they were the wrong kind of close. I sat on the floor. Yes. Again on the floor, I seemed to process things in proximity to the ground. Something about the solidity of it, the refusal of it to give way, and something that had been compressed for months came up all at once. Not grief, not exactly anger. Something underneath both of them, a kind of exhaustion that reaches below the muscles into something deeper, something that asks not with despair but with honesty, how much more of this do I have in me? I called Sophie. She picked up on the first ring. I didn't say anything for a moment. She didn't either. She had always known how to inhabit silence with me. Then she said, "I'm coming." "Sophie, it's 11 at night. I'll be there in 40 minutes. She was there in 35. She knocked at the side gate the way she always had since we were 22, the specific rhythm of her. A rhythm I would have recognized anywhere, in any city, at any hour. I let her in, and we sat in the garden in the dark, bundled in the cold, drinking tea from a flask she had brought with her. We talked for a long time. Not strategy, not legal process, not the architecture of the situation I had been living inside for 4 months. We talked about the consultancy, about a new project she was excited about a film she'd seen that she thought I would love. We talked about her mother, who was teaching herself watercolors at 67 and had just produced a remarkably terrible portrait of their family cat, which Sophie described with such affectionate precision that I laughed properly for the first time in weeks. We talked about a book we had both read years ago and come back to recently for different reasons. We talked about all the ordinary, ongoing, important things that had nothing to do with betrayal or inheritance or the legal language of family assets. And somewhere in the middle of all of it, without noticing exactly when, the weight shifted. Not lifted entirely. I was not naive enough to think a single night in the garden fixed anything structural. But shifted, redistributed, became again bearable. "Can I ask you something?" I said, "Always. Why did you never push back? When I came back here, when I said I needed to pause the consultancy, you could have. You had every right to. It cost you. I know it cost you." Sophie was quiet for a moment, looking up at the night sky, which was showing a few stars through the cloud cover in the way it sometimes did when the city happened to inhale. "Because you are the consultancy," she said. "Not the only part of it, but an essential part. Because in 12 years we have built something together, and you're going through a hard season doesn't change what we are. What we are doesn't depend on conditions being easy." She paused. "And because I knew, Claire. I always knew you would come back to it. You always do. You always come back to the things that are yours. I thought about that for a long time after she left. I thought about it for the rest of that year, in fact. The idea of coming back to the things that are yours, not out of obligation, not out of stubbornness, but out of a fundamental, constitutional orientation toward the things you have built and chosen and made real. You always do. Asterisk 6 months after the caveat was filed. The legal process concluded. There had been, in those 6 months, 4 formal meetings with lawyers, 2 sessions of mediation at which both parties were present in the same room, and the air had the particular quality of rooms in which people are being professionally prevented from saying what they actually want to say. And 1 meeting with my father alone, just the 2 of us, in which he said less than I needed him to and more than I had expected. My father signed a revised inheritance document. The company shares were to be valued by an independent auditor. The process took a further 2 months, and I would receive either an equal share of the business or a buyout payment at market value, my choice. The family home and the major properties were formally documented as joint inheritance, equal between Nathan and me. With all the legal specificity that phrase requires. I chose the buyout. This surprised everyone. Nathan had braced himself for co-ownership, for the complications of it, for a permanent entanglement of our interests that would require continuous negotiation. My father had expected me to fight for a seat at the table, to want the symbolic as well as the financial recognition of the company's shares. Victoria, I suspect, had calculated for a decade of litigation, for the grinding attrition of a dispute that would consume my resources while doing moderate damage to theirs, but I had thought about it carefully, in the specific, thorough way that I thought about financial structures, which was, after all, my profession. And what I understood was this: the business was Nathan's domain. He had been in it for 3 years, had built his relationships and his systems and his history within it. Whatever the ethics of how that had come to be, the practical reality was that co-ownership would be technically fair and practically toxic, a permanent structure that kept all of us bound together in a relationship that was not currently designed to sustain that closeness. It would be a flashpoint, an excuse, an ongoing wound that would reopen at every board meeting and every dividend payment. I wanted the money. I wanted clean edges. I wanted what was mine in a form I could take and use and build with, on my own terms, in my own time, without my brother or his wife or the complicated history of this family present in every decision I made. The auditor valued the company at $11 million. My share, $5.5 million. It took another 4 months of paperwork and transfers and careful, meticulous documentation, but it was done. It was properly, legally, permanently done. $5.5 million. And with it, something that could not be valued: the right to leave. My father aged significantly over the year of the legal process. There is something about being made to see clearly what you almost did, to hold it in front of you, in legal language, in your daughter's steady gaze across a conference table, that cost something real. He did not apologize in a grand or ceremonial way. He was not a man of grand apologies or the emotional vocabulary that would have required. But he came to me quietly in the garden one evening, about 3 weeks before I moved out, and sat beside me and said, "I was wrong. I should never have agreed to any of it. I know, Dad. Are you going to be all right?" "Yes," I said. "Are you?" Asterisk, he looked at me for a moment and then he laughed. A surprised, genuine laugh. The kind I hadn't heard from him in months. The kind that arrived unbidden and was all the more real for that. "I raised a difficult daughter," he said. "You did," I agreed. "Thank God for that." He squeezed my hand. We sat together for a while in the early evening, not speaking much. It was not full forgiveness, not yet, not the clean and complete kind that forgiveness should eventually be. But it was the beginning of one. And I believe with my father, we will get there. Not quickly, not easily, but genuinely. Because what we have now is built on something more honest than what we had before. And honest foundations, however roughly laid, are more durable than smooth ones built over silence. Nathan and I were strangers for almost a year. Not hostile, we were functional at family occasions, careful and correct, performing the appearance of a relationship that had gone temporarily dormant. But strangers to the ease and history of each other, the particular knowledge that comes from 40 years of shared reference. We began to find each other again slowly. It started with a phone call, about 8 months after I had moved out, in which Nathan called me without apparent occasion and we talked for 45 minutes. About nothing in particular, his children. My consultancy, a football team we had both followed growing up. When we hung up, I sat with my phone in my hand for a long time. I do not think Nathan and I will ever be exactly what we were before. But what we were before was built partly on a false structure, on an imbalance of expectation and value, that had been invisible to me and probably to him. Unexamined on both sides, accepted as the natural order of things. What we are building now is different. More effortful. More honest. More real. It requires more of us than the old version did. I think that is the right price for it. Victoria. And I have a relationship that exists on the surface and not beneath it. We are civil. We are even, on occasion, pleasant, particularly around her children, whom I love without complication, who are not responsible for their mother's calculations and who have nothing to do with any of this. At family occasions, we navigate the space between us with a kind of professional diplomacy that has its own cold elegance. She has not apologized. I do not expect her to. What Victoria did, she believed was correct and necessary. And she is not a woman who apologizes for things she still believes were correct. I understand this about her. I keep my distance not in anger but as a matter of structural honesty. The distance between us is the accurate representation of what exists between us. I am not pretending otherwise to make family dinners more comfortable. ***, my mother and I, this is the relationship I least expected to find transformed. And the one most changed, she began quietly, to take up space. After the resolution, after the documents were signed and the money transferred and the formal part of it was over, I watched my mother become, incrementally, someone with a voice. Not a loud voice. Not a sudden, dramatic transformation that would have been foreign to everything she was, but a voice. She began to say what she thought at dinner, not loudly but consistently. She began to disagree with my father on small things, then occasionally on larger ones. She enrolled in a women's reading circle that met twice a week, something she had wanted to do for years and never done. And she came home from those meetings with a particular brightened look I had not seen on her before. She called me on her own initiative, without occasion, simply to talk. This was new. She had always been the parent who answered the phone. Now she was the parent who picked it up. I love my mother now in a way that feels different from before. More equal. More complete. Two women who have survived the same house. Who have understood it from different angles over different decades. And who have found, on the other side of its worst moment, something warmer and more solid than what was there before. I moved out of the family home on a Thursday in September. 80 months after I had moved back in, I packed carefully and systematically. The way I approached everything now, without sentiment about the objects, with attention to what was actually mine, what I was actually taking forward. I left the room as I had found it, closed its door behind me, and said goodbye to my parents in the kitchen. And then I loaded my car and drove out of the older part of the city toward the business district. Toward the office that Sophie and I had found and prepared and named Mercer and Harwood Consulting. 2 rooms. A small meeting area, a kitchen that worked, a printer that was the subject of ongoing passionate disagreement about placement. In a proper building on a proper street with our proper names on the door. And the morning I moved in was an autumn morning and the light came from the east, and it fell across the sign like something deliberate. I stood outside that door for a long time. Sophie was inside, directing the furniture movers with the particular focused energy she brought to logistical problems. The street was ordinary around me, cars, pedestrians, the indifferent noise of a city morning going about its business. I stood in the middle of it with the autumn light on my face and the knowledge of where I had been and where I now was. And I thought, this is mine. Not in the possessive, frightened way I had thought it in the documents room, standing over papers that were trying to erase me. Not the defensive mind of someone protecting what is about to be taken. In the expansive, forward-facing way. This is mine, not because I was given it, but because I built it, chose it, fought for the freedom to pursue it, and am here now in it. With my name on the door, the consultancy grew in the year that followed. We brought on 2 staff, a young analyst named Priya, who had graduated a year ahead and worked with a precision that impressed both of us, and a client relations manager named James, who had the rare quality of making complex conversations feel simple. We took on clients in sectors we hadn't worked in before. We developed a particular specialty in family business transition and inheritance planning, which was, I suppose, inevitable. Given what I now understood about how these things could go wrong, I moved into an apartment of my own. Not large, not grand, a clean, well-lit place in a neighborhood I had always liked. The first space that held no memory except the ones I made in it. I arranged it slowly, choosing each thing with intention, making it mine not through accumulation, but through consideration. I had plants on the windowsill. I had books organized by the order in which I had loved them. I had a kitchen where I learned, in the evenings after long days, to cook things I had never had the time or space to cook before. I had good days and hard days. I dated someone for a few months, a quiet architect named Finn, gentle and thoughtful, who took me to galleries and asked good questions and never once tried to make me smaller. When it ended without damage, which felt like its own small victory, proof that endings did not have to cost the way my marriage had cost. I traveled. Sophie and I went to Portugal, partly a conference, mostly a holiday, entirely necessary. We sat on a terrace in Lisbon with glasses of wine and the city laid out below us, and we talked for 4 hours about everything and nothing. And I thought, this is also what I built. Not just the business, not just the apartment, not just the legal resolution. This friendship that has lasted 12 years and been stress-tested and has not broken. This woman who arrived on my side gate at 11 at night with a flask of tea. This, I called my mother on Sundays. I had dinner with my father twice a month, and the dinners were not always easy, but they were always real, and that was better. I rebuilt, slowly, the relationship with my brother on a more honest foundation than it had ever had. I was 32 years old. I was not finished. I understood, at last, that unfinished was not the same as incomplete. People ask me sometimes, and people will ask you, if you share this story, whether I got revenge, whether the first made them pay, whether in the end, the people who tried to erase me were punished in the way the word implies. I want to answer this honestly. No, not in the way the word revenge usually promises. Nobody suffered dramatically. Nobody was destroyed. My father is aging and occasionally uncomfortable with the memory of what he almost did, but he is loved and cared for. Nathan runs the company. Victoria continues to be exactly who she is. The Harwood family continues, adjusted, recalibrated, imperfectly renegotiating itself, as families do, and I am alive. I am working. I am building something real. I have money in my account that is mine, and a business that is mine, and an apartment that is mine, and a self that has been tested in the worst way and has not broken. Is that revenge? Maybe it is not the right word. Maybe the right word is survival that refuses to stay small. Maybe it is continuity, the fact that I am still here, still expanding, still taking up the space I was almost denied. Still writing my own sentences rather than appearing as a footnote in someone else's document. Maybe the right word is simply life, lived fully and deliberately and without apology, which is perhaps the most devastating. Possible response to people who tried to diminish you, they thought. They could write me out of the story. I wrote my own. There is a particular freedom that comes on the other side of a betrayal survived. Not the freedom of never having been hurt. That freedom is for people who have not yet lived long enough, and I no longer envy them. But the freedom of knowing what you are made of having looked at the worst version of what your family was capable of and having stood in it, fully and without flinching, and not been dissolved by it. I know what I am made of now. I know it specifically and precisely. The way you know a thing after it has been tested against something real. I am made of the flour on my mother's hands in the kitchen on a Tuesday in November when she finally said what she could no longer hold. I am made of the stubbornness I inherited from a father who does not know he gave it to me, who taught me by example that the way you protect what you have built is by refusing to let go. I am made of Sophie's voice on the phone at midnight and her knock at the gate at 11, and the particular quality of her friendship that has never required me to deserve it. I am made of Adam Clark's steady voice in his office saying you have more here than you think you do. I am made of the cold floor of a documents room at 2 in the morning and the light of a phone screen on evidence. I am made of every careful, quiet, strategic decision I made while wearing my ordinary face. I am made of the months of holding my position without becoming rigid, of loving people who were failing me without becoming naive about what was happening. I am made of everything I survived and everything I chose after. My name is Claire. I was brought back to be erased. I came back and I refused, and I'm still here, 32 years old. In an office with my name on the door, and the morning light coming from the east, building something that matters. In a world that tried once to tell me I was worth less than I am. I want you to hear this. Whoever you are reading these words, wherever you find yourself, they will tell you it is impractical to expect fairness. They will tell you that this is how families work, how the world works, that the person who insists on their own value is seen as difficult and demanding and disruptive. They will tell you, sometimes through their actions, more devastating than any words, that your place is smaller than you deserve. Don't believe them, not because the world will always reward you for standing up. It might not. The legal process might not go your way. The family might not come around. The documents might not change. The people who wronged you might never apologize, might never acknowledge it, might carry their comfortable version of events to their graves, but you will have lived truthfully. You will have looked at yourself in a mirror and recognized what you saw. You will know that you did not make yourself smaller to make someone else comfortable with what they were taking from you. And that, I promise you, is something no document can touch.